This is Source of Madness, a game that caught my attention just because of how uncompromisingly strange it looks and made me want to try it out. It is a 2D side-scroller that it uses sort of rogue-lite elements and a kind of like a twin-stick shooter-esque control scheme that just very recently released into early access and is still currently in its first version. It's got lots of cosmic horror slash Lovecraftian elements going on about it, which is always something that I enjoy, and of course promises to be a sort of spell-filled adventure through some really weird nightmarish stuff. To that end, the game actually has a couple of pieces of technology being used for it to help along the whole nightmarish cosmic horror story thing, and that is the way that the textures and the way that the animation is done in this game, so we'll start off with that. All of the textures in the game are actually created via AI. I'm guessing they're using a sort of neural network sort of idea, and I'm guessing they're also sort of plugging in some hand-created textures into it and allowing the AI to sort of finish and apply them, and this results in a truly weird appearance. The game overall has this very dreamlike cosmic horror story nightmare quality, and a lot of that is because of this grungy, gross-looking aesthetic that these AI-finished textures actually apply to the game. Now, if you know anything about how like neural network texturing works, you've probably seen some like weird Google drug trip nightmares with how it actually generates images and things. It actually makes perfect sense that they would use that technology in a game like this. It's definitely not something that you would want to see in every game, but as far as a cosmic horror themed game, it actually makes a lot of sense because it creates these very otherworldly appearing aesthetics, so it makes perfect sense that, you know, in a game like this, a sort of partially AI generated aesthetic would actually add to the overall atmosphere of the game, and it definitely does. From the buildings to the stone, especially the earth and stone textures, there's a lot of weirdness. You'll see some patterns, and of course some of that may just be your mind trying to make patterns where there aren't any, which is always fun, and some of it may be some actual patterns that have been hidden in the weird algorithmic repetition that the textures have gone through. But overall, it definitely creates a unique aesthetic, we'll say. It makes the game look very strange. The creatures are hideous, just masses of goat legs and eyeballs and tentacles, and the environment itself is highly unsettling, dreamlike, and just not quite right. You know, that sense of things being kind of okay but not quite right is the kind of thing that AI generation is actually really, really good at, visually speaking. It's good at creating believable but uncanny valley, just not quite normal appearances. So I'm actually really glad that they decided to go that route with this game. This game basically feels like sort of an experiment in using AI and procedural softwares to just create a nightmarish aesthetic and just kind of a weird game out of it. This game very much feels like a sort of proof of concept of something, and I'm into it. I'm into the sort of experimental stuff where, yeah, you wouldn't want every game to work like this, obviously, but it is fun to actually see what can be done with it when the developers are dead set on making this hideously strange journey. The game is a little bit Noita, a little bit A Valley Without Wind, and overall just very weird because of it. Another thing is that the animations on the creatures are also done by AI. This is something that you will have encountered if you've played a game like, say, Rain World, where the creatures are procedurally animated. Not the same as procedurally generated, although I think they are, in this case, that as well. But this means that the creatures move in really unsettling, incredibly strange ways, and they sort of fling themselves about in like these weird tortured spasms and cross the screen sometimes in an instant, sometimes in like a tortured crawl, and are just overall very unsettling and weird, which is, again, exactly the point, obviously. Those machine learning AI animation algorithms are very, very good at creating creatures that move in unsettling and strange ways. That's actually one of the elements of horror, by the way, that gets me the most. There's not a lot of elements of like horror media that really overtly scare me a whole lot. I'm kind of, I don't know, resistant to a lot of the cheaper tricks, so it takes a lot of effort to make some really unsettling, weird stuff that really gets me going, but stuff that moves in unnatural ways gets me every time. You know, make a four-legged creature that sort of clicks itself around in these oddly timed spasms, and it'll scare me every time. That's just how it works. So I like seeing this technology used in a game like this. Again, it's not the sort of thing that you would want in every game, but it's being used to its advantage here because, like I said, all these AI generation things are really good at making unsettling weirdness. So making a game entirely based around unsettling weirdness is a really good experiment to use these things to see what it creates. And it does create some hideously deformed, really strange creatures that just move in all sorts of weird ways, although they have gone out of their way to try and make the weirdness have some sort of order to it, by which I mean if the creatures just like spasmed around the screen in totally unpredictable ways, it would be almost impossible to avoid their attacks because you wouldn't know what parts of them are even dangerous and what parts of them are just decoration. So they've gone out of their way to make the attacks glow and to make the various appendages that they have that actually can damage you have a sort of damaging trail so that you know when they're active and what parts of the creature are dangerous to be around. This is a good idea because even though they're meant to be these masses of incomprehensible nonsense, you still need to be able to avoid their attacks. So you need to be able to know what parts of them are dangerous to be around, what parts of them actually can hit you, and what parts of them are just for locomotion or just to freak you out. So I do like that they've gone out of their way to add these glows and shines and trails to the various dangerous bits of the monsters to make sure you know how to avoid their attacks while also preserving the incomprehensible gibbering horror thing that they're going for at the same time. You play as a cultist in this strange world trying to figure out what the heck is going on and eventually actually make your way to the moon, fittingly enough, to find, well, the source of madness. And you will start with 2 rings. The game uses an entirely magic-based combat system that uses, as I mentioned earlier, twin-stick shooter-style controls. You'll be using the right analog stick or your mouse in order to aim various spells. There are melee and projectile spells, but you will not use any sort of like weapons like a sword or anything like that. All of your weaponry will be rings that contain these spells. You can also find a couple of other pieces of equipment as you adventure through the world, including more spells. Also, these 2 usable items that go above one of your spell slots that are sort of like totems or turrets, things like that, or floating guardians. You can also find robes to increase your stats, and 3 little gemstone-like items that give you passive benefits. And the farther you get into the game, the higher tier of these things that you can find that will have better and better stats and more extra abilities and components along with them to make you stronger. The game also does use a meta progression system. It has 2 currencies, a red one and a blue one. I don't know exactly what they're called. The game doesn't tell you, as far as I can tell. I'm gonna guess the red one is like some sort of blood, and the blue one is some sort of like, I don't know, we'll call it Lovecraftian spinal fluid. But basically, you get the red blood resource just by killing things. Everything you kill will give you some of it, more difficult monsters will give you more of it, and you keep it all when you die. When you revive, or choose a new character and start a new run, you will begin in this blood pool altar thingy in your cultist's temple, and you can spend this red resource across these various skill trees to unlock new spells, unlock new classes, which start with different stats and a different collection of spells and also different passive capabilities, like the Pyromancer is the only unlockable class that's currently available, which is of course based on fire spells and burning things and gets extra damage and crit chance for burning things. And of course, when the later classes do get added to the game, I'm expecting also other thematic spells based on their abilities, like some more of the blood, nature, and necromantic kind of stuff is eventually going to be added as well, because you can actually find NPCs of those various dispositions throughout the temple, although they don't do anything yet. So I'm guessing they represent some of the other classes that you're eventually going to be able to find, and the other types of spells that you're eventually going to be able to find. And the blue resource is used more for like structural upgrades, basically. Also in this blood pool, you will find a couple of nodes that use this blue resource, and it unlocks these sort of statue-esque structure thingies before you actually go out on your main run that will give you extra stuff, like the ability to start with an extra magic spell based on the various ones that can possibly drop for you and some things like that to help you out in the early game. You'll also find shops during your runs. You get some gold, or well, some sort of currency that you can only use in run from killing enemies and destroying breakable items and things, and you can spend this gold in shops as well as sell any stuff that you don't want to keep to the shop in order to buy some extra stuff. And every single level will have one of these shops in it, allowing you to customize your build a little bit before you move on. Generally speaking, the shop is placed somewhere before the boss of that area, late in that particular zone. As far as the spells and the combat goes, since that's mostly what you're going to be doing, it's actually pretty well done so far. These spells are satisfying. They feel fittingly arcane and kind of difficult to use. Very few of them are all that straightforward. Even the ones that you might think are straightforward, like the fireball, for instance, has kind of an odd delay and arc to it when being used that causes it to have its own sort of strategy to using it effectively. It's not just a simple throw a weak fireball forward. It's a much larger sort of charged attack that works a little bit differently than you might expect, and I like that. I like the fact that all of the spells are a bit weird, it means, well, first of all, it fits with the theme of the game being highly strange in general, but it also means that different collections of spells you can have 2 equipped at any given time are going to vastly change how you actually play your character because all of them are so weird. Spells will also have a sort of charged attack. Interestingly enough, the spell has a number of simple attacks that it repeats as you use it, but if you continue to use it for long enough, it will eventually charge up a sort of finisher move that works a little bit differently from its other attack. Every single spell has both of these different sorts of attacks it can do, and different spells have a different number of basic attacks that you have to perform before that sort of combo finisher comes out. For the fireball, it's as little as 3, but for some of them, it's more like 5. Some spells fire out homing projectiles, some spells fire out singular, very long-range projectiles, some of them are more shotgun-like, some of them do nature damage and fire out like bamboo spikes. Some of them can generate a huge black hole that can do huge damage to you if you stand still. There's just a lot of variety so far in what's actually available, which I like. Even though there's not a tremendous number of spells currently in the game, and I'm definitely waiting for more, what is here is highly varied, and you're going to have a hard time finding 2 spells that are just very similar to each other. Pretty much all of them act in various different ways that make them each quite unique. And one thing I've noticed so far is that the unlockable spells, which currently are only for the Pyromancer, are extremely powerful but also a bit hard to use and weird. So it seems like the kind of theme they're going for is the spells you start with are your kind of bread and butter, easier to use stuff, and the various unlockable spells are just extremely strong but only situationally useful, making them more difficult to use correctly, but very effective once you actually do figure them out. Overall, I think it's a really neat experimental game that I expect to hopefully receive some very fun updates in terms of new classes and spells to use that will really help the variety of the game out, and of course new areas to fight your way through as well. There are only a few in the game right now. The game is quite content light at the moment, which is one negative I would say about it. They are, of course, working on more new stuff, as you would expect, but as far as the current state goes, considering this is the earliest of the early access period, this is like when it first comes out, there's not a huge amount to the game as of yet, only about 4 areas to go through, 1 class to unlock, and a small handful of spells to use. But it is a good proof of concept for what is hopefully to come. As for the early access and what I would recommend as being added or changed, any sort of criticisms I have for the development of the game so far, one is that even though they've done a good job of making sure the various enemies have obvious tells, because some of them are just incomprehensible mounds of tentacles and stuff, it's important to be able to mark which things are attacking you. Even though they do have these obvious tells, sometimes it still gets so messy that you just can't tell what's going on, especially when there's one boss enemy on the screen and a couple of smaller enemies, or a whole horde of small enemies. Sometimes it's just this screen of gyrating horror and you can't even tell where you are or what's going on. So I would say that even though they've gone a good distance in making sure that you can read the enemy movements in a comprehensible way, sometimes when there's a lot of stuff on screen, like in the later levels once you get to the forest and stuff like that, it does get a bit hard to read, and the game could use maybe a little bit of visual cleanup because sometimes it is a huge mess and it's very difficult to tell what's actually happening on screen. But my biggest problem with the game right now as it stands is that it is far, far too random, like way too random. Now obviously in a game like this you expect some randomness, every run is going to be different from the last, that's part of the point. But this game reminds me of like Noita when it first launched into early access. The game is so drastically random that you can have 2 back-to-back runs that are entirely different from each other. There's very little safety net and actually making sure you get what you need. Sometimes you can have a run where absolutely no chests spawn, no extra challenge rooms to get extra items spawn, and you'll get very little money, and by the time you get to the first boss you will not have been able to upgrade your equipment at all. And then the next run you might get 3 treasure chests that spawn, 4 challenge rooms, each with their own treasure chests that spawn, and a whole bunch of extra gear and stuff, and just sail your way through the first area, and the game should not have that much variance. It seems like you are entirely at the game's mercy as to whether or not you're going to have a good run, just like Noita was when it first came out into early access. That was of course later fixed, and it later got a lot more content and a lot more polishing to make that less of the case, but that's what this game currently reminds me of, is first stage early access Noita launch, because it's just so massively random. You are far too beholden to the RNG for whether or not you're actually going to be able to live or not. As an example, one time I had 3 bosses, almost 4 bosses actually, considering one of the challenge rooms, on the very first level. One run after that, as soon as I reached the second level, the very first enemy I encountered was an enormous boss monster that is usually much later on in the zone, and for some reason decided that it wanted to be right at the very beginning chamber and didn't give me any room to move. So what I'm saying is, although I think the game is a nice skeleton right now for what could become an interesting experiment in like cosmic horror adventure with some of this weird AI created stuff, it does need its randomness toned down a little bit. It needs some of the random aspects of it to be more under the control of the developers to give you a more consistent run-to-run experience instead of being so vastly different that it's almost like you have no say in whether or not you're going to make it to the second level sometimes. So that is my current look at Source of Madness. I think it's a really cool idea, and I'm going to be keeping my eye on it because I'm excited to see what comes with the future updates and the future classes and spells and all that, because it's just so clinically weird of a game that it has my full attention as being something that I want to see it develop. So yeah, you can check out the link in the description below this video if you want to look at the game yourself on early access. Thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.